We continue now at the top of Daf Chav Ches Amud Aleph and Mesechet Sanhedrin. This is Sanhedrin Daf 28a. The Gemara continues its discussion of relatives testifying for one another. The Gemara says, Eshkechan avos lebanim, we find that fathers are not able to testify for sons. What the Gemara means over here is not just fathers for sons, but also the father's brothers, meaning uncles for the sons, ubanim la'avos, and we find also the sons cannot testify for the fathers. Again, that means to say nephews cannot testify for their uncles. V'kol shekein avos lahadadi, and certainly fathers for each other, meaning brothers for one another. We find all of those instances, banim lebanim minolin, but from where do we know that sons of one brother cannot testify for sons of another brother, meaning first cousins for one another? And the Gemara says to that, imkein lichtov kra lo yumsu avos al ben, because if that were not the case, the pasuk should have said that fathers should not die because of the son. My banim, why does it say in plural banim, the sons, da'afilu banim lahadad, even if they're sons for one another, meaning again, even if you're talking about a situation of the sons of one brother testifying for the sons of another brother, or testifying against, rather, the sons of another brother. And the Gemara continues, Eshkechon bonim lahadadi. Now we find that these sons, these first cousins, cannot testify against one another, so bonim lialma minolan, but from where do we find, let's say they together are Edim, so you have two first cousins that are Edim testifying against someone else, from where do we know that that is a problem? Amar Rami Bar Chama says, Svarhu, it's logical, Kedetanya, as we learned in a Braisa, Ein ha'edim nasin zomamin ad sheyizomu shnehen. The halach is that Edim cannot be considered Edim zomamin, false witnesses, unless both witnesses, let's say you have a set of two witnesses, both have to be falsified. Now, if it should enter your mind that these sons, these cousins, can testify against somebody else, that's kosher, so then if they should be found to be zomamin, nimtza eid zomim nereg be'edus achiv. It comes out that an eid zomim is going to be killed because of the testimony of his brother, because essentially what is happening is that they're testifying together. The only reason that the first Eid Zomim is held responsible and killed is because the second Eid Zomim also is being held responsible and being killed. So essentially, one is being killed for the other. So really it is affecting each other, and therefore it's problematic if they are related. And the Gemara continues, Amarle Rava said to him, but according to your reasoning, Haditnan, that which we learned in the Mishnah, Shlosha Achin, V'echon Mitztaref Imoin. Let's say you have three brothers. The case over here is that they're testifying about a Cheskas Gimel Shanim, that somebody was on a property for 3 years. This is in Meseches Baba Basra. So let's say you have three brothers, and then one person is joining each of the three. So now each brother is really joining someone who's not related. Hare'elu Gimel Edios, that's considered to be three separate sets of witnesses with regards to the chazaka, ve'hein edus achas lahazama, but they're all joined together in terms of the halacha of the halachas of hazama, of falsification of the witnesses. And so now you have a situation where again one brother, the brother's only being held responsible as an eid zomim when all of the brothers are falsified, and so nimsa eid zomim mishali mammon be'edus achiv. It's going to come out in this case that a false witness is paying money. Let's say he's found to be an eid zomim only because of the testimony of his brother, who's also found to be false. And so the Gemara says, Ella, rather you have to say, Hazama me alma ka'asi. You have to say that the falsification, that comes from the outside. Just because you're with another witness and you're both falsified, you're not being convicted because of the witness you were with, you're being convicted because of the witnesses that came and falsified you. So Hachanami, say the same thing over here, Hazama me alma ka'asi. The Hazama, the falsification, is coming from the outside, so to speak. And so the Gemara now goes back to its question, how do we know that these relatives cannot testify against somebody else? Ella, rather say as follows, Imkein lichtov kra uven al avos. If that was the case, that they could testify against someone else, it should have said uben al avos, inami heim al avos, or say the words heim al avos, they are against the fathers. My ubonim, why does the pasuk use the word ubonim? Afilu ubonim lialm. It means to say, even again, the relatives testifying against somebody else, that is a problem. And the Gemara continues, Eshkechon krove ha'av. Now we find from all of these psukim, if you have paternal relatives, relatives through the father, that's a problem. But krove ha'eim minolan, from where do we know if it's maternal relatives, relatives through the mother side, that's a problem? Amar Kra, the pasuk says avos trezimni. It says avos 2 times. Im eno inyan lekrove ha'av. If you don't need to say it a second time for the relatives through the father, teneu inyan lekrove ha'eim, then you can instead say the pasuk is referring to relatives through the mother. Eshkechon lechova. Now we find in this pasuk that you can't testify against in order to convict. But lezechus minolan, from where do we know that the relatives cannot testify lezechus in order to make the person innocent. Amar Kra, the pasuk says yumsu trei zimni. It says yumasu, they're going to die. It says that twice. Why does it have to say it twice? If you don't need the extra time to say the person is guilty, instead you should apply it to say the person is innocent. And the Gemara continues, Eshkechon b'dinei nefashos. Now we find all of this is talking about capital cases. It's talking about yumasu, b'dinei mamanis minolan. From where do we know? By monetary cases that this is true. Amar Krotz, because the pasuk says mishpat echad yeh lachem. It says it's all one law, and that means mishpat hashava lachem. It has to be a law that is equal. Whatever applies by dinei nefashos applies by dinei mamanis in this regard. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav. Rav says, Achi Abba, the brother of my father, meaning my uncle, lo yoidli, he cannot testify about me. Hu uveno v'chasano, that applies to him and his son-in-law. They all cannot testify about me. And afani, it also goes the other direction. I also, lo oyed lo, I cannot testify about him. And that applies to ani, that applies to myself. Uveni v'chasani, it applies to my son and my son-in-law as well. And the Gemara asks, Ve'amai, now why is this true? Rav over here is saying that his son is not allowed to testify about his uncle, but havale shlishi barishon, that's a separation of two generations. That would be a third generation. The son of Rav, let's say, is a third generation, and the uncle of Rav is a rishon. That's a first generation. And so Rav is saying a third generation cannot testify about a first generation. Va'anon sheni b'sheni tanan, but we learned in our Mishnah that a second generation can't testify about a second generation, and sheni barishon tanan, we learned that a second generation cannot testify about a first generation. But shlishi barishon lo tanan, it doesn't say anywhere in the Mishnah that a third generation is not allowed to testify about a first generation. So where is Rav getting this disqualification from? And the Gemara continues and answers, Mai chasano de katani v'masnisin. In our Mishnah, when it talks about son-in-law, what does that mean? It actually means chasan beno. It actually means the son-in-law of his son. It actually is referring to a third generation. The Mishnah is mentioning a psul of shlishi barishon. There is a problem of the third generation testifying with regards to the first generation as well. But the Gemara says, if that's the case, v'lisni ben beno. But if that's the case, if chasano doesn't mean the person's son-in-law, but it means the person's son's son-in-law, so then just keep it simpler and simply say his grandson. Just say ben beno. Why does it say the chasano, the son-in-law of the son? And the Gemara answers to that, Milsa agav orchei kamashmal, and the Mishnah is teaching us something along the way, the Baal ki ishto, that a husband is like his wife. So over here it's a son-in-law, he's related through his wife, and that's considered the same. That's what the Mishnah is teaching us by saying chasano. But the Gemara continues, Ve'lahadatani Rabbi Chia, but according to that which Rabbi Chia taught, Shmona Avos, there are 8 principal relatives that are mentioned in the Mishnah, Shein Esrim V'Arba, but if you're going to expand that to the generations, it's actually going to be a total of 24. The idea over here is, why should it expand to be 24? Because you're including their sons and their son-in-laws, so it's 8 times 3, that's the 8 principal relatives, and then their sons, that's 8 times 2 is 16, and then their son-in-laws, that's considered 8 times 3, that's 24. Now, if you're going to expand that to another generation, so then it should be Hani Tlosin V'Tartan Havi. It actually should be a total of 32. Essentially, what the Gemara is asking is it shouldn't go to 24. We should go now to another generation, and let's just assume sons and son-in-laws all the same thing, even if we assumed that in the other generation, but still it's going to be 8 times 4. You're going to add another 8, and that should be at least 32. And so therefore, what Reb Chia is saying seems to imply that we're not going to say there's a disqualification from the first to the third generation. And so the Gemara instead says, Ella rather liolam chasano mamish. Really, the Mishnah, when it says son-in-law, it means his son-in-law. And therefore, if it's talking about his son-in-law, so it's not going to the third generation. Where does Rav get this idea that there's a disqualification to the third generation? V'amai kari le chasan beno. Why is he referring to it as chasan beno? Meaning to say, why are we considering this like a third generation? Kevin de me'alma ka'asi, because since a son-in-law in general comes from the outside, he marries into the family. Kedor acher dami. We consider that like another generation, and therefore Rav derives from that the disqualification extends even from Shlishi to Rishon, even if there's a separation of 2 generations. But the Gemara says, if so, if you're going to say that a chasan is considered to be like another generation, so then havelei shlishi b'sheni. So then what you really have in the Mishnah is a situation of third generation testifying with regards to a second generation. Now that becomes problematic according to the Mishnah, because we're moving the son-in-law down a generation. V'Rav achsher shlishi b'sheni, but it happens to be that Rav says that it's kosher for a third generation relative to testify with regards to a second generation relative, so that doesn't work either. And so the Gemara says, Ella Rav da Rav, who says that there's a disqualification to testify a third generation relative to a first-generation relative, he's actually following the sheet of Rebbe Elazar. Tanya, because we learned in a brayso, Rebbe Elazar Omer, Rebbe Elazar says, Keshem shachi abba lo yoed li, just like the brother, my father can't testify for me, hu uveno v'chasano, him, and that applies to his son and his son-in-law, kach ben achi abba lo yoed li, so too, the son of the father of my brother can't testify for me, hu uveno v'chasano, that applies to him, and his son-in-law. But the Gemara continues, Vakati, but still, according to Rebbe Elazar, it even goes further. Havale shlishi b'sheni, Rebbe Elazar is saying that a third generation cannot testify for a second generation, because Rebbe Elazar is saying that the grandson of my uncle cannot testify against me. But V'Rav achshar shlishi b'sheni, but Rav actually says that it's okay for a third generation to testify for a second generation. He only said it's problematic for the third generation to testify against the first generation. And the Gemara answers to that, Rav savar le kivase b'chada upalagale b'chada. Rav holds like Rebbe Elazar in one regard, but he argues with him in another regard, meaning to say, Rav does disqualify the third generation, but he doesn't go as far as Rebbe Elazar. Rebbe Elazar says the third generation is considered disqualified to testify even against the second generation, but Rav only says the third generation is disqualified against the first generation. And the Gemara says, my time at Rav. Now, what is the reason of Rav? The Yamar Krotz, because the pasuk says, Lo yumsu avos albonim ubonim. It says, Lo yumsu avos albonim ubonim. And that addition over there, the fact that it phrases it in that manner is L'rabos dor acher. That's in order to include, in other generation, we darshan from the pasuk, that additional generation of disqualification. And that drasha is coming from the vav of ubonim, for Rebbe Elazar and Rebbe Elazar, that he adds also third generation to second generation, albonim amarachmona. It says albonim in the pasuk, and we add on even further, psule de avos shadi abonim. The disqualifications of the father, we say, apply to the sons as well, and therefore third to second generation applies as well. And Rashi explains, Rebbe Elazar karav sfirale, Rebbe Elazar holds like Rav, the vav l'rabos, also that the vav is an inclusion, v'darish albonim l'meimar, and then he darshans that it also says albonim to say, t'chol dipsile liavos pasal abonim, whatever disqualifications you have for the father apply to the sons as well. Hilkach, therefore, kihechi de gimel barishon pasal, just like third generation to first generation is pasal, so to shlishi b'sheni nami pasal, so to third generation to second generation is also pasal, because we add the sons as well. And the Gemara continues, Amar of Nachman says, Achi chamosi lo yoed li, the brother of my mother-in-law cannot testify against me. Ben achi chamosi lo yoed li, also the son of the brother of my mother-in-law cannot testify against me. And ben achos chamosi lo yoed li, also the son of the sister of my mother-in-law cannot testify against me. And the Gemara says, V'tana tuna, we learn this in the Mishnah as well, from the other perspective, Baal achoso, the husband of his sister, Ubal achos aviv, and the husband of the sister of his father, Ubal achos imo, and the husband of the sister of his mother, Heinu v'nein v'chasnein, they, their sons and their son-in-laws, all cannot testify. And just to explain this in one particular example, if Rav Nachman is saying the brother of his mother-in-law, Achi Chamosi, he's saying the brother of his mother-in-law cannot testify for him. So from the perspective of that individual, that brother of his mother-in-law, so that brother, it's actually his sister's son-in-law, and that's exactly this case over here, V'chasnein, the son-in-law, talking about Baal Achoso, talking about his sister, so it's just viewing it from the other perspective. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ravashi says, Ki avinan be'ula, when we were by Ula, Iboilan, we had the following question, Achi chamav ma, what about the brother of his father-in-law? Or ben achi chamav ma, what about the son of the brother of his father-in-law? Or ben achos chamav ma, what about the son of the sister of his father-in-law? Amar Lani said to us, Tanisua, that also was taught in the Mishnah, because it said in the Mishnah, Achiv v'achi aviv v'achi imo, it said his brother, the brother of his father, or the brother of his mother. But then it said, Heinu v'nein v'chasnein, it said them, their sons, and their son-in-laws. By saying son-in-laws, so again, if you look at it from the other perspective, it's no longer going to be his father, but it's going to be his father-in-law, and essentially the Mishnah is saying these exact cases. And the Gemara continues, Rav ikla lemizvan, Rav went to a certain place to buy, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chav Ches Amid Beis.